Hello, and welcome to ZzScience. Wherever you are right now, I hope you found a comfortable place. Maybe you're settling in for the night. Maybe the day has been long or full or just ordinary. However it's been, you can let it rest now. Tonight, we're going to talk about something quiet, something that lives in the spaces between things, between water and land, between one form and another. We're going to talk about amphibians, not in a hurry, not rushing through facts or jumping to conclusions, just taking our time. The way these creatures themselves have taken time, millions of years of it. So, if you're comfortable, we'll begin. There's something about amphibians that feels almost impossible when you really think about it. They live two lives, not metaphorically, actually. A frog begins its existence in water, breathing through gills, swimming with a tail. And then, slowly, it changes. It grows lungs. It grows legs. The tail disappears. And it climbs out onto land. Two different worlds, two different ways of being alive. And this isn't some recent adaptation. This is ancient. This transition from water to land, it happened a long time ago, hundreds of millions of years ago. And in some ways, amphibians have been living in that in-between space ever since. They never fully committed to one or the other. They kept both. Let's go back, way back. About 400 million years ago, give or take. The Earth looked different then. The continents weren't where they are now. The climate was different. And life was mostly in the water. The oceans were full of it, fish of all kinds, creatures with armor-like scales, some with jaws, some without. They'd been evolving for a long time already, these fish, adapting to different depths, different temperatures, different ways of finding food. But the land was mostly empty. There were plants, yes. By this time, plants had made it onto land. They'd started small, hugging the ground, staying near water. But gradually they'd spread. They'd grown taller. Forests were beginning to appear. Primitive forests, nothing like what we see today, but forests nonetheless. And where there are plants, there are opportunities. Food, shelter, space. But for a fish, land was unreachable. You can't just swim up onto shore and expect to survive. You need to breathe air. You need to move without water holding you up. You need to keep your body from drying out. These aren't small problems. But some fish were already dealing with some of these problems. Not because they wanted to live on land, just because of where they lived. Shallow water, swamps, tidal pools, places where the water level changed, where oxygen levels dropped, where sometimes the water almost disappeared entirely during dry seasons. If you're a fish in a drying pond, you have a problem. You need oxygen. And when the water is warm and shallow and stagnant, there's not much oxygen in it. So some fish developed a way to gulp air from the surface. They had simple lungs, or lung-like structures. Nothing fancy, just a way to grab a little extra oxygen when they needed it. They still had gills, they were still fish, but they could breathe air when they had to. And some of these fish had another feature. Their fins were different. They were fleshy, lobed. They had bones inside them and muscles. You could almost call them stubby. These are called lobe-finned fish. And they're important. Because from fish like these, amphibians would eventually emerge. Now, evolution doesn't have a goal. It's not trying to get anywhere. It's just responding. Organisms that are slightly better at surviving in their particular environment tend to have more offspring. Those traits get passed on, and over many, many generations, species change. So these lobe-finned fish weren't trying to become land animals. They were just living in their difficult, swampy, oxygen-poor environments. And the ones that were slightly better at getting oxygen, slightly better at pushing themselves through shallow water or across mud, those ones did a little better. Generation after generation, small changes accumulating. A slightly stronger fin, a slightly better lung, a slightly tougher skin. Nothing dramatic, not at first. Time passes slowly in evolution. We're talking about millions of years here. Millions of years of tiny changes. Most individuals live and die without anything particularly unusual happening. But the species as a whole is shifting. And eventually, some of these lobe-finned fish were spending more and more time in very shallow water, or even out of the water entirely for short periods. Maybe following prey, maybe escaping predators, maybe just because the water they were in had dried up and they needed to drag themselves to another pool. And here's the thing. On land there was food. Insects had made it onto land by this point. Small arthropods, crawling things, and there were no other vertebrates there to eat them. If you could survive on land, even for a little while, there was an entire buffet waiting. The first amphibians appeared around 370 million years ago, maybe a bit earlier. The fossil record is always a bit fuzzy on exact dates. These early amphibians didn't look like modern frogs or salamanders. They looked more like stubby crocodiles, maybe, or very strange lizards. They still spent most of their time in water, but they could venture onto land. One of the most famous early amphibians is called Tiktaalik. Though technically, Tiktaalik is considered a transitional form, something between a lobe-finned fish and a true amphibian. It lived about 375 million years ago. Tiktaalik had gills and scales, like a fish, but it also had lungs. And its fins, its front fins especially, they had wrist-like joints, shoulder-like structures. It could do something like a push-up. It could lift its head above water. It could prop itself up in shallow streams. It was built for an environment that was half water, half land. After Tiktaalik and creatures like it came the true amphibians, the first tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates. Their fins had become legs, not great legs at first. They were sprawled out to the sides, a bit awkwardly. Walking was probably clumsy, more of a waddle, a belly drag. But it worked, and over time it got better. The bones in their limbs became stronger, the joints more flexible, the muscles more efficient. Their skulls changed shape. Their spines became more rigid, better at supporting weight without water to help. They were becoming land animals, but they never left the water completely. And that's the thing about amphibians. They kept both worlds. They lay their eggs in water, soft eggs without hard shells, eggs that would dry out on land. So they need water to reproduce. And when those eggs hatch, out come larvae, tadpoles in the case of frogs. These larvae have gills. They breathe water. They're fully aquatic. Only later, as they grow, do they transform. Metamorphosis. Lungs develop, legs grow, gills are absorbed, and they become adults that can live on land. But even as adults, most amphibians stay near water. They need it. Their skin is thin and permeable. They breathe through it actually, not just through their lungs, through their skin. Which means They need to keep their skin moist. If it dries out, they can't breathe properly. They can die. So they live in damp places, under logs, near streams, in wet forests. They come out at night, when the air is cooler and more humid. They are creatures of thresholds. Let's think about what it takes to make that transition, from water to land. What has to change? First, breathing. In water, you use gills. You pull water in through your mouth, push it out over your gills, and oxygen diffuses from the water into your blood. It works well, as long as you're in water. On land, gills don't work. They collapse without water to support them. They dry out. They're useless. So you need lungs. Lungs are basically internal pockets of tissue, richly supplied with blood vessels, where air comes in and oxygen diffuses into the blood. They're kept moist inside, but they're protected from drying out. Early amphibians had simple lungs, not as efficient as modern mammal or bird lungs, but good enough. And many amphibians also breathe through their skin. Their skin is thin, moist, and full of tiny blood vessels. Oxygen can pass right through it. In some salamanders, skin breathing is actually more important than lung breathing. But this means the skin has to stay wet. It can't have scales or thick protective layers. It's vulnerable. Then there's movement. In water, you're supported. You can push against the water with fins or your tail. You don't have to hold your body up. Gravity is less of an issue. On land, gravity matters. A lot. You need strong limbs. You need a strong spine. You need to lift your body off the ground and move it forward without water to help. The lobe-finned fish already had the beginnings of this. Those fleshy fins had bones in them, bones that would eventually become the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the bones of our own arms. The same bones in the legs of a frog. Evolution repurposed those fin bones into limbs, and the shoulder girdle and hip girdle had to change too. They had to support weight. They had to anchor strong muscles. Walking on land takes a lot of structural change. And then there's the issue of drying out. In water, you're surrounded by it. You don't have to worry about losing moisture. But in air, evaporation happens, constantly. Fish have scales and mucus to protect them, but even so, they're adapted for water. On land, you need something more. Amphibians never really solved this problem completely. Their skin is still thin and moist. They still lose water easily. So they have to stay in humid environments. They have to retreat to water or wet hiding spots regularly. Reptiles would later evolve scales and waterproof skin. Mammals and birds would develop other strategies. But amphibians, they stayed vulnerable. It's one of the things that makes them so sensitive to environmental changes. Their skin is permeable. It absorbs things easily. Water, oxygen, but also toxins, pollutants, chemicals. They feel the world more directly. Let's talk about senses for a moment. In water, you rely on certain senses more than others. Sight can be useful, but water isn't always clear. Sound travels, but differently than in air. Many fish rely on their lateral line system, which detects vibrations and pressure changes in the water. On land, the sensory landscape is different. Air is clearer. You can see farther. But sound travels differently. And there's no water to carry vibrations in the same way. Amphibians had to adapt their senses. Their eyes changed. Fish eyes are adapted for seeing underwater, where light behaves differently. Amphibian eyes needed to work in air. The shape of the lens changed. The way the eye focuses changed, and they developed eyelids. In water, you don't need eyelids. But in air, your eyes can dry out. So eyelids appeared. Thin membranes that could keep the eyes moist. Hearing changed too. Fish don't have external ears, but they can sense vibrations. Amphibians developed a tympanic membrane, an eardrum. It allowed them to hear airborne sounds. Not perfectly. Amphibian hearing isn't as sophisticated as mammal hearing. But it worked. They could hear predators. They could hear potential mates calling. And speaking of calling, many amphibians developed voices, frogs especially. Male frogs call to attract females. Each species has its own call. Some are high-pitched chirps. Some are deep booming croaks. Some sound like whistles or trills. Vocal communication became important. It's a way to find each other in the dark, in dense vegetation, near water. Smell mattered too. In water, detect chemicals dissolved in the water. Taste and smell are closely related. On land, you're detecting chemicals in the air or on surfaces. Amphibians have a decent sense of smell. They use it to find food, to avoid predators, to find their way back to breeding ponds. Some salamanders can navigate over long distances, returning to the exact pond where they were born. They seem to use a combination of smell, Earth's magnetic field, and memory. It's impressive for an animal with a relatively small brain. Now, the brain itself had to change when vertebrates moved onto land. Not dramatically at first, but over time. In fish, the brain is relatively simple. Different regions handle different things. Vision, smell, movement, balance. In amphibians, the forebrain started to become a bit more prominent. This is the part of the brain involved in processing smells and, eventually, in more complex behaviors. But amphibian brains are still quite simple compared to reptiles, birds, or mammals. They rely a lot on instinct, hardwired behaviors that work well enough. When threatened, freeze or flee. When it's breeding season, go to water. When you see something small and moving, try to eat it. Simple rules, but effective. Let's pause here for a moment. We've covered a lot. The transition from water to land, the changes in breathing, movement, senses, skin, the compromises amphibians made. Because that's what evolution is, in many ways. Compromise, trade-offs. You gain something here, you lose something there. Amphibians gained access to land, new food sources, new habitats, less competition at first. But they never fully left the water. They kept their dependence on it, for reproduction, for moisture, for part of their life cycle. They exist in between. And maybe that's made them vulnerable in some ways. But it's also allowed them to persist for hundreds of millions of years. They found their niche, and they've stayed in it. The early amphibians, those first tetrapods, diversified. They spread into different environments, different climates. Some became quite large. There were amphibians the size of crocodiles. Predators, lurking in swamps and rivers. Some stayed small, insect eaters, hiding under leaves. Some adapted to drier environments, spending more time on land. Others stayed almost entirely aquatic, only coming onto land briefly. And from these early amphibians, other groups would eventually evolve. The reptiles, which would go on to become dinosaurs, birds, lizards, snakes, crocodiles. The line of evolution that would eventually lead to mammals. All of it traces back to those first amphibians, those creatures that learned to live in two worlds. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For a long time, amphibians were the dominant land vertebrates. This was the Carboniferous period, roughly 360 to 300 million years ago. The world was warm and wet. Vast, swampy forests covered much of the land. Giant ferns, towering, trees that would eventually become coal deposits. And in these swamps, amphibians thrived. They had relatively few competitors, no large reptiles yet, no mammals, no birds, just amphibians. And insects, lots of insects. Some of those insects were huge. Dragonflies with wingspans as wide as a hawk's, millipedes as long as your arm. It must have been a strange world. Dense, green, humid. The air thick with the smell of vegetation and decay. And in the water and on the muddy banks, amphibians. Hunting, basking, calling. But climates change, and over millions of years, the earth began to dry out, at least in some places. The great swamps began to shrink, forests changed, seasons became more pronounced. This was hard for amphibians. They need moisture. They need stable, wet environments. And around this time, reptiles were evolving. Reptiles had several key advantages. Their eggs had hard shells and internal membranes. They could lay their eggs on land, away from water. The eggs wouldn't dry out. And reptile skin was tougher, covered in scales, less permeable. They could venture into drier environments without risking dehydration. Reptiles didn't need to return to water to reproduce. They were freed from that constraint. And over time, reptiles began to dominate. They diversified. They adapted to all sorts of environments. Deserts, mountains, forests, oceans even. Amphibians, meanwhile, stayed tied to water. They remained in the damp places, the wet forests, the stream edges, the ponds. They became less prominent, smaller, more specialized. But they didn't disappear. Today, there are around 8,000 species of amphibians. That's actually quite a lot. More than there are species of mammals. They're divided into three main groups: frogs and toads. These are the ones most people think of when they hear amphibian. They're by far the most diverse group. Around 7,000 species. Salamanders and newts. These look more like lizards with long tails. There are around 700 species. And caecilians. These are the weird ones. They look like large earthworms or snakes. They're mostly blind. They burrow underground in tropical regions. There are around 200 species. Most people have never seen a caecilian. They're secretive, hard to find. But all three groups share that basic amphibian lifestyle. Moist skin, eggs in water or very damp places, often a two-stage life cycle. They've survived, for hundreds of millions of years, through mass extinctions, through climate changes, through competition with reptiles, mammals, birds. They've found their place, and they're still here. Let's think about what that means. To live for hundreds of millions of years as a group, to survive everything the Earth can throw at you. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, shifting continents. Amphibians have seen all of it. They were here long before the dinosaurs. They watched the dinosaurs rise and fall. They were here when the first mammals appeared, when the first flowers bloomed, when the continents split apart and came back together. They've been quiet witnesses to almost the entire history of life on land. And they've done it by being adaptable in their way, not by conquering new environments, but by finding the small, damp, overlooked places and making them home. Under rocks, in leaf litter, in the cracks of bark on trees, in temporary pools, in mountain streams, places where the competition is less fierce, where being small and moist and inconspicuous is actually an advantage. There's a frog that lives in the cloud forests of Central America. It's called the glass frog. Its skin is translucent. You can see through its belly. You can see its organs, its heart beating, its eggs developing. It's a strange thing to look at, almost unsettling, like the frog forgot to be opaque. But it's an adaptation. When it sits on a green leaf, the translucent skin makes it harder to see. It blends in. The light passes through it. It's just one example of the strange and beautiful ways amphibians have adapted to their specific environments. There are frogs that can freeze solid in winter and thaw out in spring, alive. There are salamanders that spend their entire lives in underground caves, never seeing daylight. There are toads that live in deserts, buried in the sand for months, waiting for rain. Each species has found its niche, its particular way of surviving. And all of this traces back to those first tentative steps onto land. Those early tetrapods, dragging themselves out of drying pools, gulping air, pushing with their stubby limbs. They probably didn't go far, just a few meters, just enough to reach the next pool. But it was the beginning of something. A new way of being alive. And even though amphibians never fully committed to land, even though they kept one foot in the water, so to speak, they made it possible for everything else. Without amphibians, there would be no reptiles, no birds, no mammals, no us. We owe them something. These small, moist, overlooked creatures. They were the pioneers. It's easy to overlook amphibians today. They're not as charismatic as mammals, not as colourful as birds, usually, not as dramatic as reptiles. They're quiet, they hide, they come out at night. You might hear frogs calling in the evening near a pond, a chorus of croaks and peeps. But you might not see them. They're good at staying hidden. Salamanders slip under logs and leaves, silent, slow-moving. Sicilians, well, you're almost certainly never going to see a Sicilian unless you go looking for one specifically in a tropical rainforest and start digging. They live their lives in the margins, in the in-between places. And maybe that's appropriate, because that's what they are. In-between creatures, between water and land, between fish and reptiles, between past and future. Let's talk about their skin again for a moment, because it's important. Amphibian skin is remarkable. It's thin, smooth in frogs, sometimes rough in toads. In salamanders, it can be slimy, coated in mucus. And it's alive in a way that reptile scales or mammal fur isn't. It's directly connected to the world. Oxygen passes through it. Carbon dioxide passes out. Water passes through it in both directions. It's a membrane between the amphibian's body and the environment. Porous, permeable. This is why amphibians are so sensitive to pollution. If there are pesticides in the water, or heavy metals, or any number of chemicals, they absorb them. Through their skin, directly into their bodies. They can't filter it out the way we might. They can't avoid it. This makes them vulnerable. But it also makes them valuable. They're indicator species. Bioindicators, scientists call them. If amphibians are doing well in an environment, that environment is probably healthy. If amphibians start to disappear, something is wrong. They're like the canaries in the coal mine, early warning systems, and right. Now, amphibians are in trouble. We'll talk about that more later, but it's worth mentioning, because it's part of their story now. They survived for hundreds of millions of years, but in the last few decades, they've been declining rapidly. Habitat loss, pollution, disease, climate change, all of it hitting them at once. Some scientists call it an amphibian crisis, amphibian extinction crisis. It's estimated that around 40% of amphibian species are threatened with extinction. That's a staggering number, more than any other group of vertebrates. And it's happening quietly, because amphibians are small and hidden and easy to overlook. But it matters a lot. Not just for the amphibians, for the ecosystems they're part of, for the balance of life. But we're still in part one here. We're still talking about origins, about how amphibians came to be. And the point is this: they came from water. They learned to breathe air. They learned to walk on land. And they did it slowly, over millions of years, through countless small changes, each generation a little different from the last. There was no single moment when a fish became an amphibian, no single individual that crossed the line. It was gradual, blurry, a transition. Like most things in evolution, like most things in life really, change happens slowly. So slowly you might not notice it day to day, but over time it accumulates, and eventually you look back and everything is different. The first amphibians probably didn't know they were pioneering anything. They were just trying to survive, find food, avoid being eaten, reproduce. The same things every living thing tries to do. But by surviving, by adapting, by passing on their genes, they changed the world. They opened up the land. They made it possible for vertebrates to live there, to thrive there. And in doing so, they became something unique, something that doesn't quite belong fully to water or fully to land. They became amphibians, creatures of the threshold. There's something poetic about that, maybe. Living between worlds, never quite settling in one place. It's a hard way to live, in some respects. You have to meet the demands of both environments. You're vulnerable in both. But it's also given them a kind of resilience, a flexibility. When the swamps dried up, they found new swamps. When climates changed, they adapted. When reptiles took over the drier lands, amphibians stayed in the wet places. They didn't try to compete directly. They found their niche and held on to it. And that's worked for a very long time. So that's the beginning of the story, the origin. Hundreds of millions of years ago, in warm, shallow waters, some fish began to change. They developed lungs. Their fins became limbs. Their bodies adapted to support themselves on land. And eventually, they crawled out. Tentative, awkward, but alive. And from them came all the land vertebrates, all the four-legged creatures, everything with a backbone that walks or crawls or runs or flies. It all started with amphibians, with that first step onto land. We'll take a pause here. Let the story settle. In the next part, we'll talk about how amphibians live today, their life cycles, their behaviors, the different kinds of amphibians, and how they've adapted to their specific environments. We'll slow down even more, look at the details, the quiet, everyday life of a creature living between two worlds. But for now, rest with this. Amphibians are ancient. They are survivors. They are the bridge between water and land. And they're still here, still calling in the night, still hiding under logs, still laying their eggs in quiet ponds, still living their two lives. Welcome back. Or, if you're just continuing from where we left off, then we're simply moving forward, gently. In the first part, we talked about origins, how amphibians came to be, that long, slow transition from water to land. Now we're going to talk about how they live, what their lives are actually like. Because knowing where something came from is one thing. Understanding how it exists day to day, that's something else. So let's slow down. Let's look closely. Let's spend some time with amphibians in their world. Imagine a pond. Maybe you've been to one. A small pond in a forest or a field. The water is still, or nearly still, dark, reflecting the trees around it. The surface is covered in places with algae, green and thick, duckweed maybe, lily pads. The edges are muddy, soft. Cattails grow there and reeds. Grasses hang over the water. It's quiet. Not silent, there's sound. The hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, birds somewhere in the distance. And if you sit very still and you wait, you might hear a plop. Something has moved in the water. If you're patient, if you don't move, you might see it. A head breaking the surface. Eyes just above the waterline, watching. A frog. Frogs are probably the most familiar amphibians. Most. People have seen one at some point. There are around 7,000 species of frogs and toads. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. In almost every environment you can imagine, as long as there's some water nearby. Tropical rainforests, temperate woodlands, grasslands, deserts even, high mountains, anywhere damp enough, anywhere they can complete their life cycle. And that life cycle, that's where we'll start. Because it's the defining feature of most amphibians. That transformation, that metamorphosis, from water to land, from one form to another. Let's say it's spring. In temperate regions, spring is breeding season for many frogs. The weather warms, snow melts, rain comes, ponds fill, and male frogs begin to call. If you've ever been near a pond in spring, you've probably heard this. That chorus. Each species has its own call, but together it's a symphony of croaks and peeps and trills. The males are calling to attract females, and to warn other males, to establish territory. It's loud, surprisingly loud sometimes. These are small animals, but they can produce a lot of sound. The sound is made by pushing air from the lungs over vocal cords and into a vocal sac. The sac inflates like a balloon, amplifying the sound. Some frogs have one vocal sac, some have two. Some species can call so loud you can hear them a mile away. It's all about being noticed. By females, by rivals. The females listen. They're choosy, often. They listen for the right call, the right pitch, the right rhythm. And when a female chooses a male, she approaches him, often in the water. Frogs don't have elaborate courtship rituals usually. It's fairly direct. The male climbs onto the female's back, gripping her with his front legs. This is called amplexus, and then she lays her eggs. And he fertilizes them, externally, in the water. The eggs are laid in clusters, masses of jelly with tiny dark dots inside. Each dot is an egg, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. The jelly protects them, keeps them together, keeps them moist. But it's not a hard shell. It's soft, permeable. The eggs are vulnerable to predators, to changes in water temperature, to drying out if the water level drops. Many won't survive, but some will. Inside each egg, a tiny embryo begins to develop. It happens quickly, in a matter of days, usually. Sometimes just a few days. Sometimes a week or two, depending on the species and the temperature. The embryo grows. It curls up inside the jelly. You can start to see its shape. A head, a tail, no legs yet. And then it hatches. A tadpole. Tadpoles are strange little creatures. They don't look like frogs, not at all. They're basically fish, for a while. They have a tail for swimming. They have gills for breathing. External gills at first, feathery structures on the sides of the head. Later, those gills become internal, covered by skin. They have a mouth, but it's small, shaped like a little beak. They eat algae, mostly. And detritus, bits of decaying plant matter. They scrape it off surfaces. They filter it from the water. Some tadpoles are omnivorous. Some will even eat other tadpoles if food is scarce. They swim in schools, often. Little dark shapes darting through the water. Dozens of them together, hundreds. And they grow. Slowly at first, then faster. The time a tadpole spends as a tadpole varies a lot by species. Some frogs metamorphose in a few weeks. Others take months. Some take a year or more. It depends on the environment, on temperature, on food availability. But eventually, changes begin. First, the back legs start to appear. Little buds at the base of the tail. They grow slowly, lengthen, develop toes. Then the front legs. They grow inside the body at first, hidden under the skin. Then they break through. The tail starts to shrink. It's not lost, it's absorbed. The body reabsorbs the tissue, recycling it. The mouth widens. The digestive system changes. The tadpole was a vegetarian, mostly. The adult frog will be a carnivore. Lungs develop. The gills disappear. The eyes move. They become more prominent, positioned for seeing above water. It's a complete transformation. Almost every system in the body changes. And then one day, the tadpole climbs out of the water. It's not a tadpole anymore. It's a tiny frog, fully formed, with 4 legs and no tail. It can breathe air. It can hop. It's still very small, vulnerable. Many predators would happily eat it, but it's made the transition, from water to land. It's done what its ancestors did hundreds of millions of years ago. It's recapitulated that ancient journey in the span of a few weeks or months. This process, metamorphosis, is controlled by hormones, thyroid hormones specifically. As the tadpole grows, hormone levels rise, and when they reach a certain threshold, metamorphosis is triggered. All those changes, the legs, the lungs, the tail reabsorption, they're all orchestrated by hormones. It's a delicate process. If something disrupts it, if the water is polluted with endocrine disruptors, chemicals that interfere with hormones, metamorphosis can go wrong. Tadpoles can fail to develop properly. They can get stuck in an in-between state, or they can die. This is one reason why amphibians are so sensitive to pollution. Their development depends on precise chemical signals, and external chemicals can scramble those signals. But let's say everything goes well. The young frog has metamorphosed. It's on land now. What does it do? It eats, mostly. Frogs are carnivores. They eat insects, spiders, worms, anything small and moving. They're sit-and-wait predators, usually. They find a spot, they stay very still, and they watch. Frogs have good vision, especially for movement. If something moves in their field of view, they notice it immediately. And if it's the right size, if it looks like food, the frog strikes. Fast. Very fast. The mouth opens. The tongue shoots out. The tongue is sticky. It hits the prey and sticks to it. And then it's pulled back into the mouth. All in a fraction of a second. The frog swallows. Often, frogs will blink when they swallow. Their eyes actually retract into their skull slightly, pushing down on the food, helping to force it down the throat. It's efficient. Frogs don't chew. They don't have teeth, most of them. Or if they do have teeth, they're small, just for gripping, not for chewing. So they swallow their prey whole. This limits what they can eat. It has to be small enough to fit in their mouth. But within that constraint, frogs will eat almost anything that moves. Flies, beetles, moths, crickets, ants, mosquitoes. In some places, frogs are important for pest control. They eat huge numbers of insects. A single frog might eat hundreds of insects in a night. They're part of the food web, part of what keeps insect populations in check. But frogs are also prey. Many things eat frogs: birds, snakes, fish, mammals. Other frogs, sometimes. So staying hidden is important. Most frogs are colored to blend in. Green to match vegetation, brown to match mud or bark. Some have patterns that break up their outline, making them harder to see. And they're good at staying still. Predators often rely on movement to spot prey. If the frog doesn't move, it might not be seen. Some frogs have other defenses: poison, toxins in their skin. There are frogs in Central and South America called poison dart frogs. Tiny, brilliantly colored frogs. Bright red, blue, yellow, orange. The bright colors are a warning, aposematism. They're saying, "Don't eat me, I'm toxic." And they are. Some species are extremely toxic. The toxins come from their diet, mostly. From the ants and mites they eat. The frogs sequester the toxins in their skin. A bird or snake that tries to eat one of these frogs will get very sick, maybe die. So predators learn. They see the bright colors and they avoid the frog. Not all frogs are poisonous, of course. Most aren't. But even non-poisonous frogs often have mildly toxic or irritating skin secretions. It's part of keeping their skin moist. They secrete mucus, and that mucus can have compounds in it that taste bad or cause mild irritation. If you've ever handled a frog and then rubbed your eyes, you might have noticed a burning sensation. That's from the skin secretions. It's not dangerous to humans, usually, just unpleasant. But it's enough to discourage some predators. Frogs are most active at night, or at dawn and dusk. During the day they hide. Under logs, in leaf litter, in burrows, in the water sometimes, sitting on the bottom or among plants. At night, when it's cooler and more humid, they come out. They hunt. They call if it's breeding season. They're adapted for low light. Their eyes are large, sensitive. They can see well enough to catch insects in near darkness. And their hearing is good. They can hear the movements of insects, the calls of other frogs, the approach of predators. They're alert, always watching, always listening. Because danger is constant when you're small and soft and edible. Let's talk about salamanders now. Salamanders are less familiar to most people than frogs. They're more secretive. They live quieter lives. There are around 700 species of salamanders. Most are found in the Northern Hemisphere, North America especially, Europe, Asia. They're absent from Africa, most of Asia and Australia. No one is quite sure why. Probably historical accident. The right conditions for salamanders to evolve and spread didn't exist in those places. But where they do exist, they're often abundant. If you flip over a log in a damp forest in eastern North America, you'll probably find a salamander. Small, dark, slender, with 4 legs and a long tail. Salamanders look a bit like lizards, but they're not related to lizards at all. Lizards are reptiles. Salamanders have that characteristic amphibian skin, moist, permeable, no scales, and they move differently than lizards. Slower usually, more deliberate. They can't afford to dry out, so they're careful about where they go. They stay in damp places, under things, in leaf litter, under bark, in streams. Salamanders have a similar life cycle to frogs in many species. Eggs laid in water, larvae with gills, metamorphosis, adults on land. But there are more variations in salamanders. Some salamanders are fully aquatic their whole lives. They never metamorphose completely. They keep their gills. They keep their tail fins. They stay in the water. These are called neotenic salamanders. They reach sexual maturity while still in a larval form. The most famous example is the axolotl, a Mexican salamander. It looks like a big, smiley tadpole with external gills, feathery pink or white gills on the sides of its head. Axolotls never naturally metamorphose. They stay aquatic. Though interestingly, if you give them thyroid hormone, they can be induced to metamorphose. They'll lose their gills, develop lungs, and become land salamanders. But in nature, they don't. They stay in the water. Other salamanders have no larval stage at all. They lay their eggs on land, in damp places, under logs, in moss. And the eggs develop directly into tiny salamanders. No tadpole stage, no gills. This is more common in salamanders than in frogs. It's an adaptation to living in places where there isn't always water available for a larval stage. Salamanders are generally slow-moving, methodical. They walk with a side-to-side gait. Their legs stick out to the sides. They have to bend their body as they walk, snaking a bit. It's not fast, but it doesn't need to be. Salamanders aren't chasing down prey. They're ambush hunters, like frogs. They eat worms, insects, slugs, snails, small arthropods. They hunt mostly by smell and by detecting movement. Their eyesight is okay, but not great. And they have sticky tongues too, some species. They can flip their tongue out to catch prey. But many salamanders just walk up to their prey and grab it with their mouths. Simple, effective. Salamanders are important in forest ecosystems. They're often the most abundant vertebrate in a forest by weight. There might be more salamanders in a hectare of forest than all the birds and mammals combined. But you don't see them, because they're underground, under logs, in the leaf litter. They're eating huge numbers of invertebrates, breaking down organic matter, cycling nutrients. They're a key part of the ecosystem. Hidden, unnoticed, but essential. And then there are the caecilians. Caecilians are strange. They look like worms, or snakes. Long cylindrical bodies, no legs. Small eyes, or no eyes at all in some species. Many are nearly blind. They burrow, underground, in tropical regions. Africa, South America, South Asia. Most people will never see one. They're secretive, hard to find. Scientists don't know as much about caecilians as they do about frogs or salamanders. They're just harder to study. But what we do know is fascinating. Caecilians have a unique sensory organ, a tentacle, a small, retractable tentacle between the eye and the nostril on each side of the head. It's a chemosensory organ. They use it to detect chemicals in the soil, to find prey, to navigate. It's not found in any other vertebrate, only caecilians. They also have small dermal scales embedded in their skin, unique among amphibians. A remnant, maybe, from some ancient ancestor, or a convergent adaptation. No one is quite sure. Caecilians lay eggs, some species, but many give birth to live young, and some species have a bizarre form of parental care. The mother's skin thickens and becomes rich in nutrients, and the babies, they peel off layers of the mother's skin and eat it. It's called dermatotrophy, skin eating. The mother lies still while her babies feed on her skin. They have special teeth for it, tiny hook-like teeth. It sounds horrific, but it's a way to nourish the young. The mother's skin regenerates, and the babies grow. It's one of the many strange and wonderful adaptations in the amphibian world. Let's talk about breathing again, because it's central to amphibian life. We mentioned earlier that amphibians breathe through their lungs and their skin, but the balance between the two varies a lot. Some salamanders have no lungs at all. Plethodontid salamanders, lungless salamanders. They're the largest family of salamanders, hundreds of species. They breathe entirely through their skin and the lining of their mouth. This works because they're small, and they live in very moist environments, and they're not very active. Oxygen can diffuse through their skin quickly enough to meet their needs. In fact, losing the lungs might have been an advantage. Lungs take up space in the body. Without them, the body can be more slender, more flexible, better for squeezing into tight spaces. These salamanders can live in crevices in rocks, under bark, in spaces other salamanders can't access. For amphibians with lungs, breathing is a bit different than in mammals. We breathe by expanding our chest. Our ribs move. Our diaphragm contracts. This creates negative pressure in the lungs, and air rushes in. Amphibians don't have a diaphragm, and their ribs aren't set up for that kind of breathing. Instead, they use positive pressure breathing. They lower the floor of their mouth, drawing air in through their nostrils. Then, they close their nostrils, raise the floor of their mouth, and push the air into their lungs. It's called buccal pumping. Mouth pumping. If you watch a frog sitting still, you'll see its throat moving, pulsing. That's breathing, or at least part of it. Some of that air is going to the lungs. Some of it is just moving back and forth in the mouth for gas exchange in the mouth lining. Breathing through the skin is efficient in some ways, but it requires that the skin stay moist. If an amphibian dries out, gas exchange stops. Oxygen can't diffuse through dry skin, and carbon dioxide can't escape. The animal suffocates. This is why amphibians avoid dry environments, why they hide during the day, why they come out when it's humid. Moisture is life for them. There are exceptions. Some frogs and toads have adapted to drier environments. Desert toads, for instance. They spend most of the year buried underground, waiting. When the rains come, they emerge. They breed frantically, lay eggs in temporary pools. The tadpoles develop quickly, metamorphose before the pools dry up, and then young toads burrow back underground, where they'll wait for the next rain. Maybe a year, maybe longer. They can survive this because they have adaptations, thicker skin, the ability to store water in their bladder, a slower metabolism. But even they need moisture eventually. Let's talk about temperature. Amphibians are ectotherms, cold-blooded in common language. They don't regulate their body temperature internally. They rely on the environment. If it's cold, they're cold. Their metabolism slows. They become sluggish. If it's warm, they're warm. Their metabolism speeds up. They become more active. This has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that they don't need to eat as much. Maintaining a constant body temperature, like mammals and birds do, requires a lot of energy, a lot of food. Amphibians can get by on much less. They can go days or weeks without eating. The disadvantage is that they're limited by temperature. If it's too cold, they can't function. If it's too warm, hot, they can die. So they have to be careful. They have to find the right microclimates. A sunny spot to warm up. A cool, damp spot to avoid overheating. They're always adjusting, moving to stay within their preferred temperature range. In winter, in temperate regions, amphibians have to deal with freezing temperatures. Most hibernate. They find a safe spot, underground, under logs, at the bottom of ponds. Their metabolism drops, way down, almost to nothing. They don't eat, they barely move, they just wait. Some frogs bury themselves in mud at the bottom of ponds. They absorb oxygen from the water through their skin, very slowly, just enough to stay alive. Other frogs burrow into the soil below the frost line. And some species can actually freeze. Wood frogs, spring peepers, chorus frogs. When temperatures drop below freezing, ice forms in their body. Not inside their cells, that would kill them. But in the spaces between cells. Their heart stops. Their breathing stops. They're frozen, solid. But they're not dead. When spring comes and they thaw, their heart starts beating again. They breathe. They move. They come back to life. It's an incredible adaptation. They produce special proteins and sugars, like glucose, that protect their cells from damage during freezing. It's basically biological antifreeze. In tropical regions, amphibians don't have to deal with freezing, but they have other challenges. Dry seasons. In many tropical areas, there's a wet season and a dry season. During the dry season, water disappears. Streams dry up. Ponds evaporate. Amphibians have to cope. Some burrow and wait, like desert toads. Some move to permanent water sources. Some hide in very humid microhabitats. In tree holes. In bromeliads. Bromeliads are plants that hold water in their leaves. Little pools. And frogs have discovered them. There are frogs that spend their entire lives in bromeliads. They lay their eggs there. The tadpoles develop there. The adults live there. An entire life in a plant. It's a tiny, self-contained ecosystem. Amphibians have also adapted to different elevations. There are frogs that live high in mountains, above 3,000 meters, 4,000. It's cold up there. The air is thin. There's less oxygen. But frogs have adapted. Their lungs are more efficient. Their blood carries oxygen more effectively. And there are salamanders in mountain streams. Cold, fast-flowing streams. They cling to rocks. They have flattened bodies to reduce drag. They breathe through their skin. The cold, oxygen-rich water provides plenty of oxygen. They're specialized, adapted to very specific conditions. And this is true of amphibians everywhere. Each species is adapted to its particular niche, the specific temperature range, the specific humidity, the specific type of water or soil or vegetation. They're specialists mostly, not generalists, which makes them vulnerable when things change. If their habitat changes, if the temperature shifts, if the water dries up, if pollution arrives, they can't easily move to a new habitat. because their requirements are specific. A frog that lives in mountain streams can't just move to a lowland pond. The conditions are too different. So habitat loss is devastating for amphibians, more so than for many other animals. Let's talk about senses a bit more. We mentioned vision. Amphibians generally have good vision for detecting movement, but there's more to it. Frogs, especially, have interesting vision. Their eyes are positioned on the sides of their head, giving them a wide field of view, nearly 360 degrees. They can see almost all around them without moving their head. This is useful when you're a small animal surrounded by predators, but it also means they don't have great depth perception. Their eyes don't overlap much in the front. They judge distance more by movement, by how quickly something is getting larger in their field of view. And they have a strong response to small, moving objects. It's almost automatic. They see something small moving, and they orient toward it. Prepare to strike. It's hardwired. Hearing is important too. Frogs use sound extensively. For communication, for finding mates. Their hearing is tuned to the frequencies of their own species' calls. They're very good at picking out the call of their species from a noisy chorus. And females can judge the quality of a male by his call. The frequency, the duration, the repetition rate. All of these give information about the male's size, health, stamina. It's mate selection through sound. Salamanders are quieter. They don't vocalize much. Some species can make squeaking sounds, but it's rare. They rely more on smell, chemical communication. They leave scent marks, pheromones. Other salamanders can detect these and know that the territory is occupied. And during mating, many salamanders use elaborate chemical signals. The male deposits a spermatophore, a packet of sperm, on the ground. And he does a courtship dance with the female, leading her toward the spermatophore. She follows, and if she's receptive, she picks it up with her cloaca. It's all done through behavior and chemical cues. Very little sound. Touch is important too. Amphibian skin is sensitive. It has to be. It's their interface with the world. They can feel vibrations, changes in pressure, temperature, moisture. They're constantly sensing their environment through their skin. It's how they know when it's safe to come out, when the humidity is right, when the temperature is comfortable. They're tuned in, sensitive. There's something meditative about watching amphibians. If you sit by a pond at dusk, and you stay still, and you watch, you might see a frog emerge from the water, slowly, just its eyes and the top of its head. It sits there, watching, not moving. Minutes pass, 5 minutes, 10. Nothing happens. The frog doesn't seem impatient. It's just there, waiting. And then, suddenly, it lunges. So fast you almost miss it. It's caught something, an insect probably, and then it goes back to stillness, waiting. There's a patience to it, a simplicity. Amphibians don't rush, they don't worry, they just exist. Doing what they do, eating when food is available, hiding when it's not, breeding when the time is right. Let's think about time for a moment. An amphibian's sense of time is different from ours. They don't have plans. They don't anticipate the future in the way we do. They respond to cues, environmental cues. When the days get longer and the temperature rises, hormones are triggered. Breeding behavior begins. When food is available, they eat. When it's not, they wait. When it's too hot or too cold, they retreat. When conditions are right, they emerge. It's all stimulus and response, instinct and environmental cues. But it works. It's worked for hundreds of millions of years. There's a simplicity to amphibian life that's almost elegant. They don't need much. Moisture, food, a place to hide, a place to breed. They don't build, they don't accumulate, they don't plan, they just live. In the moment, responding to what's immediate. And there's something we could maybe learn from that, if we wanted to, about being present, about simplicity, about existing without constant striving. But maybe that's too philosophical. Let's stay with the frogs. One more thing about amphibian behavior: territoriality. Many male frogs and salamanders are territorial during breeding season. They claim a spot, a calling site for frogs, a good breeding area, and they defend it. In frogs, this is usually done through calling. A male will call louder, longer, more aggressively if another male approaches. Sometimes there are physical confrontations. Males will wrestle, push each other, try to dislodge the rival. But usually it doesn't come to that. The calling is enough. The smaller male, or the less persistent one, backs off. In salamanders, territories are marked with pheromones and defended with displays, tail waving, body posturing. Actual fights are rare, too risky. An injury could mean death when you're small and living in an environment full of predators. So displays and signals usually suffice. There's a lot more we could say about how amphibians live. The details are endless. Each species has its own peculiarities, its own adaptations. Frogs that glide from tree to tree. Frogs that carry their tadpoles on their backs. Salamanders that can regrow lost limbs. Frogs that change colour. The diversity is astonishing. But the underlying theme is the same. They're creatures adapted to live between water and land, to navigate both worlds, to survive in the margins and the thresholds. They're sensitive, vulnerable, but also resilient in their way. They've found their place, and they hold on to it. We'll pause here again. In the final part, we'll talk about amphibians and the modern world, the challenges they're facing, what they mean to us, what we can learn from them. But for now, rest with this image. A frog sitting at the edge of a pond, half in water, half on land, breathing through its skin, watching the world with ancient eyes, still, patient, alive. Here we are, the third part. By now, you know where amphibians came from. You know how they live. Now we need to talk about where they are today and where they might be going. This part is harder because it's less about biology and more about change, loss, uncertainty. But it's important. So let's move forward, gently, as always. Amphibians are in trouble. That's the simple truth. Around the world, amphibian populations are declining. Species are disappearing. It's happening quietly, because amphibians are small. They're hidden. They live in places most people don't go. But scientists have noticed. They've been noticing for decades now. And the numbers are alarming. It's estimated that about 40% of all amphibian species are threatened with extinction. That's more than 2,000 species. Some have already gone extinct, vanished completely. Others are down to tiny populations, hanging on. It's being called the amphibian extinction crisis, and it's happening faster than almost any extinction event in recent history. Why? There's no single reason. It's a combination of things, multiple pressures all happening at once. Habitat loss is a big one, maybe the biggest. Amphibians need specific habitats: wetlands, forests, streams, ponds, and these habitats are disappearing. Wetlands are drained for agriculture, forests are logged, streams are polluted or diverted, ponds are filled in. In many parts of the world, there's just less suitable habitat for amphibians than there used to be. And because amphibians are specialists, because they're adapted to specific conditions, they can't easily move somewhere else. If their pond is destroyed, they can't just find another pond. It might be too far away, or it might not have the right conditions, so they die. The population disappears. Pollution is another major factor. Remember, amphibians' skin is permeable. They absorb things from the environment directly into their bodies. This makes them extremely vulnerable to pollutants. Pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, heavy metals, industrial chemicals. All of these can end up in the water, in the soil, in the air, and amphibians absorb them. Even at low concentrations, some chemicals can cause problems. They can disrupt development, interfere with reproduction, weaken immune systems, cause deformities. There are studies showing frogs with extra legs, missing legs, frogs that can't develop properly. Often pollution is the cause, and it's not always obvious. You might look at a pond and it seems fine. The water is clear. There are plants growing. But there might be chemicals in that water, invisible, but deadly to an amphibian. Climate change is affecting amphibians too. They're sensitive to temperature, to moisture, to the timing of seasons. And all of these are changing. In some places, it's getting warmer. Dry seasons are lasting longer. Rainfall patterns are shifting. Ponds that used to fill reliably every spring might now dry up before tadpoles can metamorphose. Streams might warm beyond the tolerance of the species that live there. Breeding seasons might shift. But if the shift doesn't match the availability of food or the right water conditions, breeding can fail. Climate change creates mismatches between when something happens and when it needs to happen. And amphibians can't adapt quickly enough. Evolution takes time, many generations. Climate is changing faster than amphibians can evolve. And then there's disease. There's a fungus, a chytrid fungus, Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. It's usually just called BD. It infects amphibian skin. And remember, amphibians breathe through their skin. They regulate water and electrolytes through their skin. When this fungus infects the skin, it disrupts those functions. The amphibian can't breathe properly, can't regulate its fluid balance. It dies. And this fungus has spread around the world. It's in almost every region where amphibians live. Some species are resistant, others are extremely vulnerable. Entire populations have been wiped out by this fungus. Species have gone extinct. It's believed that human activity spread the fungus through trade in amphibians, through movement of contaminated equipment, through introduction of infected animals. We accidentally spread a plague through the amphibian world, and it's still spreading. There's another fungus too, Batrachochytrium salamandrivorans, B-sal. It affects salamanders. It's not as widespread as BD yet, but it's just as deadly to the species it infects. It's in Europe, and there are fears it could reach North America, where there's incredible diversity of salamanders. If it does, it could be catastrophic. Scientists are trying to stop its spread. But it's difficult. Fungal spores are tiny, easily transported, hard to detect. So amphibians are facing habitat loss, pollution, climate change, and disease all at once. Any one of these would be a serious problem. Together, they're overwhelming. And the result is that amphibian populations are crashing. Species that were common 20 years ago are now rare or gone. It's happening in tropical rainforests, in temperate forests, in mountains, in deserts, everywhere. Let's pause for a moment, because this is heavy, and it's easy to feel helpless when faced with information like this. But it's important to understand, because amphibians matter. Not just for their own sake, though that would be enough, but for what they tell us. Amphibians are indicators, remember? Their skin is permeable. They're sensitive to changes in the environment. When amphibians start disappearing, it's a warning. It means something is wrong with the environment. And if the environment is bad for amphibians, it's probably bad for other things too. Maybe not immediately, maybe not obviously, but the problems that affect amphibians will eventually affect other species, including us. Healthy ecosystems need amphibians. They're part of the food web. They eat enormous numbers of insects. They're eaten by birds, snakes, mammals, fish. Remove amphibians, and you create holes in the food web, imbalances. Insect populations might explode, or predators that relied on amphibians for food might decline. Everything is connected. And amphibians are an important connection. There's also something else, something harder to quantify. Amphibians have been around for hundreds of millions of years. They're ancient. They're survivors. They've witnessed the rise and fall of dinosaurs, the breaking apart and reforming of continents, ice ages, mass extinctions, and they're still here. Or they were. If we lose them now, if we drive them to extinction through our actions, we're losing something irreplaceable. A living link to the deep past. A branch of the tree of life that's been growing for longer than we can really comprehend. Once it's gone, it's gone. There's no bringing it back. But it's not hopeless. There are things being done. Conservation efforts, protected areas, habitat restoration, captive breeding programs for critically endangered species. Some scientists are working on ways to treat the fungal diseases, probiotics that help amphibians fight off the infection, breeding programs to select for resistant individuals. There are efforts to reduce pollution, to create wildlife corridors so amphibians can move between habitats. Education programs, citizen science projects where people monitor local amphibian populations. It's all happening. People are trying. And there have been some successes. Some species have been brought back from the brink. Some populations have stabilized. It's possible to make a difference. But it requires effort, resources, political will, public awareness. And right now, amphibians don't get a lot of public attention. They're not as charismatic as pandas or tigers. They don't make the news like elephants or whales. They're small, slimy sometimes, not cuddly. But they're just as important, just as deserving of protection. Maybe more so in some ways, because they're more vulnerable. Let's think philosophically for a moment. What do amphibians represent? They're creatures of transition, of in-between spaces. They live between water and land, between past and future, between one form and another. They're flexible, adaptable in their way. They transform, but they're also fragile, sensitive, dependent on conditions being just right. Maybe there's a lesson there about balance, about the need for both flexibility and stability, about how sensitive life can be to changes in its environment. We live in a world that's changing rapidly. Climate, technology, society. And like amphibians, we're trying to adapt, to find our place in a changing world. But adaptation has limits. Change can happen too fast. Conditions can become too harsh. And when that happens, things fall apart. Amphibians are showing us that. They're the canary in the coal mine, the early warning. They're telling us that the environment is changing in ways that are harmful, that we need to pay attention, that we need to act. Or maybe that's too abstract, too metaphorical. Maybe the lesson is simpler. Take care of the small things, the overlooked things, the things that live quietly in the margins. Because they matter, not just as symbols, not just as indicators, but in themselves. A frog has value, not because it's useful to us, not because it tells us something about environmental health, but because it's alive, because it's part of the world, part of the vast, intricate web of life. And that's worth preserving. There's a concept in conservation biology. It's called the extinction vortex. It's the idea that once a population gets too small, it can spiral toward extinction. Small populations are more vulnerable to disease, to inbreeding, to random events. A bad year, a flood, a drought. Any of these can wipe out a small population entirely. And once you're below a certain threshold, it becomes very hard to recover. This is where many amphibian species are now, in the extinction vortex, teetering on the edge. Some will make it, with help, with luck. Others won't. It's hard to think about. Extinction, the finality of it, the irreversibility. There's a species of frog, the golden toad. It lived in the cloud forests of Costa Rica, bright orange, beautiful. It was discovered in 1966. By 1989, it was gone, extinct. 23 years. That's all it took, from discovery to extinction. No one is entirely sure what happened. Probably a combination of things: climate change, disease, habitat changes. But it's gone, and we'll never see it again. Never hear its call, never watch it hop through. The moss, it's just gone. And it's not the only one. There are dozens of species that have gone extinct in recent decades. Dozens more that probably will in the next few decades. It's a loss we can barely comprehend. But let's not end on despair, because there's still time. There are still amphibians out there. Millions of them, billions maybe. Calling in the night, hiding under logs, laying eggs in ponds, living their lives. And as long as they're there, there's a chance. A chance to protect their habitats, to reduce pollution, to mitigate climate change, to treat disease, to let them continue, to give them a future. Here on ZzScience, we like to take our time, to look at things carefully, to appreciate the details. And amphibians deserve that. They deserve our attention, our care. They've been around so much longer than we have. They've survived so much. They deserve to keep going. Let's think about what we can do as individuals. It can feel overwhelming, like the problems are too big, too far away, beyond our control. But there are things. Support conservation organizations. Learn about local amphibian species. Create habitat in your own yard if you can. A small pond. Damp, shady areas. Places for amphibians to live. Don't use pesticides, or at least reduce them. Chemicals you put on your lawn can end up in streams and ponds, where amphibians live. Drive carefully on rainy nights in spring. In many areas, That's when amphibians are migrating to breeding ponds. They cross roads, thousands of them sometimes. If you can, slow down. Watch for them. It's a small thing, but it matters. If you're near a body of water, don't release pets into it. Fish especially. Goldfish, tropical fish. They can compete with native amphibians, eat their eggs, spread disease. Keep pets where they belong, in aquariums, in homes. And if you handle amphibians for any reason, wash your hands. Before and after. Don't transfer chemicals or pathogens between sites. These are small actions, but collectively they add up. Enough people doing small things can make a difference. Or maybe you're not in a position to do any of that, and that's okay. Maybe just pay attention, notice, appreciate. If you hear frogs calling at night, stop and listen for a moment. Really listen. Each call is an individual, an animal that hatched from an egg, that transformed from a tadpole, that survived predators and weather and all the challenges of life. Each call is a small miracle, a continuation of something ancient, and it's worth acknowledging, worth appreciating. There's something grounding about amphibians, about their quiet persistence. They're not flashy, they're not dramatic, they just keep going. Generation after generation, adapting, surviving, existing. In a world that's often chaotic and overwhelming, there's something calming about that, about the simple fact of their existence, their rhythms, their patterns. Spring comes and they breed. Summer comes and they hunt. Fall comes and they prepare for winter. Winter comes and they wait. And then spring again, over and over, for millions of years. There's a steadiness to it, a reliability. But it's not guaranteed. That's what we're learning now. Things that seemed eternal can change, can disappear. Nothing is permanent. Not even patterns that have repeated for millions of years. And that's unsettling. But it's also a reminder to pay attention, to not take things for granted, to act when action is needed. Let's return to that image from earlier, the frog at the edge of the pond, half in water, half on land, living between worlds. It's a liminal creature, a threshold creature. And thresholds are interesting places. They're places of transition, of possibility, but also of vulnerability. You're neither here nor there. You're between. And that can be uncomfortable, uncertain. But it's also where change happens, where transformation occurs. Amphibians have mastered the threshold. They've made it their home. They've shown that it's possible to live in two worlds, to be part of both, to transform from one to the other. And maybe that's what makes them so important right now. We're living in a time of thresholds, of transitions. The climate is changing. Ecosystems are shifting. Species are moving, adapting, or failing to adapt. We're between the world that was and the world that will be. And like amphibians, we're vulnerable in this in-between space, uncertain, exposed, but also maybe capable of transformation, if we pay attention, if we adapt, if we care for the things that need caring for. Amphibians aren't going to save the world. Let's be clear about that. They're not going to fix climate change. They're not going to clean up pollution. They're not going to solve human problems. But they're indicators, guides, teachers. They show us what's happening. They tell us when things are going wrong. And they remind us that we're part of something larger, an ecosystem, biosphere, a living planet. What affects them affects us. Eventually, we're all connected, all breathing the same air, drinking the same water, living on the same earth. And the health of one part affects the health of the whole. There's a concept in ecology. It's called a keystone species. A keystone species is one that has a disproportionate effect on its ecosystem. Remove it, and the whole system changes, often collapses. Amphibians aren't usually considered keystone species, not in the formal sense. But in some ecosystems, they're close. They're so abundant. They eat so many insects. They're eaten by so many predators. Their presence or absence ripples through the system. And in a broader sense, they're keystones for our understanding. They tell us about water quality, air quality, habitat health. They're integrators. They experience the environment in multiple ways, as eggs in water, as larvae in water, as adults on land. If something is wrong in any of those stages, they show it. They're living monitors, biological sensors. And right now, the sensors are alarming. But sensors don't fix problems, they just detect them. We have to do the fixing, and that means choices, changes, effort. It means protecting habitats, reducing pollution, addressing climate change, supporting conservation. It means caring, paying attention, acting. Not just for amphibians, for everything, because it's all connected. Let's talk about timescales again. Amphibians have been around for hundreds of millions of years. We've been around, as modern humans, for maybe 300,000 years. Civilization, agriculture, cities, that's only about 10,000 years. Industrial civilization, 200 years, maybe less. We're newcomers, extremely recent arrivals. And in our very brief time here, we've changed things dramatically. We've altered the climate. We've reshaped the landscape. We've driven species to extinction at rates not seen since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. We've had an enormous impact in a very short time, and amphibians, who've been around so much longer, are now struggling to cope with changes we've caused. There's something humbling about that, and something troubling. We're the new species, the adaptive, clever, fast-changing species. And we're overwhelming ancient lineages. Creatures that survived everything the Earth could throw at them for hundreds of millions of years, until us. But we're also the species that can choose, that can reflect, that can change course. We're not locked into one path. We have agency, collectively at least. We can decide to protect rather than destroy, to restore rather than degrade, to coexist rather than dominate. It's possible. We've done it before. There are species that have been brought back from near extinction, ecosystems that have been restored. It's not easy. It requires sustained effort, resources, commitment. But it's possible. And amphibians, as much as any group, deserve that effort. Think about a salamander in a forest. It's under a log. It's been there for hours, maybe days. It's not doing anything, not visibly, just existing. Its skin is breathing, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Moisture evaporating slowly, being replenished from the damp wood and soil. Its heart is beating, slowly. A few beats per minute, maybe. Its nervous system is processing information, chemical cues, vibrations, temperature. It's waiting for night, for coolness, for humidity. When conditions are right, it will emerge. It will hunt. It will eat. And then it will return to hiding and wait again, day after day, week after week. A simple life, a small life, but a life nonetheless, as valid as any other, as worthy of continuation. There are billions of moments like this happening right now, all over the world. Frogs in ponds, salamanders under logs, Sicilians in soil, all living their small, quiet lives, breathing, eating, waiting, reproducing, continuing the patterns that have continued for hundreds of millions of years. And each one of those moments is fragile, contingent, dependent on the pond not being drained, the log not being removed, the soil not being poisoned, dependent on conditions staying within certain bounds. And those conditions are changing, rapidly, in ways that amphibians can't easily cope with. So those moments are at risk, all of them. The frog calling, the salamander hunting, the tadpole transforming, all of it could stop, is stopping in many places. And once it stops, it doesn't restart. Not easily, not quickly. Extinction is final. But let's not dwell only on loss. Let's also think about what remains. Because there are still places where amphibians thrive. Protected areas, wilderness, places where humans have a lighter touch. National parks, nature reserves, community forests. In these places, you can still hear the full chorus, the full diversity. Dozens of species calling, each with its own voice, its own rhythm. It's a sound that reaches back millions of years. A sound that would have been familiar to early mammals, to dinosaurs even. The sound of life, of continuation. And it's still there, in the right places, at the right times. And it's worth protecting, worth preserving, not just as a museum piece, not just for nostalgia, but because it's part of the living world, the functioning world, the world that supports all of us. There's a word in conservation biology, biophilia. It means love of life, love of living things. The idea is that humans have an innate tendency to seek connections with nature, with other forms of life. It's not universal, it's not absolute, but it's there in many of us. That sense of wonder when you see an animal in the wild, that curiosity, that desire to understand, to connect. Maybe you feel it, maybe you felt it, watching a frog, listening to birdsong, walking through a forest. That feeling of being part of something larger, something ancient and complex and beautiful. Biophilia. And if we can tap into that, if we can foster it, if we can let it guide our choices, then maybe we can build a world where amphibians thrive, where all life thrives, not just in protected pockets, but broadly, abundantly. It's a vision, an aspiration, not a certainty, but it's worth working toward. Let's return to the beginning, to that transition, from water to land. It happened once, hundreds of millions of years ago. Fish with stubby fins dragging themselves onto muddy banks, gulping air, surviving, adapting. And from that, everything. All land vertebrates, all of us. It was one of the great transitions in the history of life, as significant as the origin of life itself, as the evolution of multicellular organisms, as the colonization of land by plants. A threshold moment, a transformation. And amphibians carry that history. They embody it. Every time a tadpole metamorphoses, it recapitulates that ancient journey, water to land, gills to lungs, tail to legs. It's a living reminder of where we came from, how we got here, and that's worth something, worth preserving, worth protecting, not for sentimental reasons, or not only for sentimental reasons, but because it's part of our story, part of the story of life on Earth. And stories matter. They tell us who we are, where we came from, what's important. And the story of amphibians is a long one, a rich one, a complex one. It deserves to continue. So here we are. At the end of this long, slow story, we've talked about origins, about evolution, about how amphibians came to be. We've talked about their lives, their adaptations, how they exist day to day. And we've talked about challenges, about decline, about the uncertain future. It's been a journey, through time, through science, through reflection. And if you're still here, still listening, thank you. Thank you for taking this time, for giving attention to these small, overlooked creatures, for caring, or at least for being willing to learn. Amphibians won't make the news. They won't trend on social media. They won't capture headlines. But they're important, deeply important, as indicators, as ecosystem members, as survivors, as teachers, and as living beings with their own right to exist. They've been here longer than we have. They've endured more than we can imagine. They deserve to continue. And whether they do, that's partly up to us, to our choices, our actions, our willingness to make room for other forms of life. If you take one thing from this, let it be this: pay attention, notice, appreciate the small things, the quiet things, the things that live in the margins. They matter, not just as symbols, not just as warnings, but in themselves. A frog is a frog, a salamander is a salamander, and that's enough. That's reason enough to care. It's late now, or early, depending on how you measure. And this has been a long story, maybe too long. But some stories need time, need space to unfold. The story of amphibians is one of those stories. It spans hundreds of millions of years. It touches on evolution, ecology, climate, disease, conservation, philosophy. It's vast, complex, ongoing, and it's not finished. The ending hasn't been written yet. That's still being determined. By what we do, by what we choose. Somewhere, right now, a frog is calling. In a pond, in a forest, in a marsh. Somewhere, a salamander is hiding under a log, waiting for night. Somewhere, a tadpole is transforming, growing legs, developing lungs, preparing to climb onto land. Life continues, for now. And with effort, with care, with attention, it can continue. These creatures of the threshold, these living links to the ancient past, they can have a future if we let them. Thank you for listening, for being here, for spending this time with amphibians, with their story. I hope you're comfortable. I hope this has been calming, informative, maybe even meaningful. And I hope, if you hear frogs calling someday, you'll remember this. You'll stop. You'll listen. You'll appreciate the sound, the persistence, the ancient pattern continuing, the life between water and land. Rest well, and remember the amphibians. Good night.